In October 1994, in a small town in Saxony that had been behind the Iron Curtain for 45 years, a watchmaker presented 4 watches to the public for the first time in over 4 decades. The man presenting them was Walter Lang, 70 years old at the time, the great-grandson of Ferdinand Adolf Lang, who had founded the family manufacture in Glashütte in 1845. Walter had watched the Soviet military dismantle his family's factory in July 1945, removing the machinery piece by piece, loading it onto trucks, taking it east. He had watched the Lange name disappear from watch dials in 1951, absorbed into the nationalized East German watchmaking collective. He had spent 40 years unable to do anything about it. Then the Berlin Wall fell, then German reunification happened, and on December 7, 1990, exactly 145 years after his great-grandfather registered the original business, Walter Lang registered A. Lang & Söhne for the second time in the history of the family. 4 years later, he stood in front of the watch industry with 4 watches and an outsized date complication he had patented, and the Swiss watchmaking establishment looked at what he had produced in a bombed-out former Soviet industrial town in Saxony and went directly to their boardrooms. We are going to explain what they were afraid of, why they were right to be afraid, and why German watchmaking in the 30 years since that October presentation has built a case against the Swiss luxury industry that the Swiss industry has never been able to fully answer. The Swiss watch industry's dominance is built on a narrative that the industry has managed with remarkable consistency for over a century. The narrative is that precision mechanical watchmaking is a Swiss discipline, that the Vallée de Joux and the cantons of Geneva, Neuchâtel, and Bern are the places where the craft lives, and that the Swiss-made label on a dial is the terminal guarantee of quality that everything else in the category is measured against. That narrative is built on real history. The Swiss did develop the lever escapement to commercial viability. The Swiss did create the chronometer standard. The Swiss did survive the quartz crisis when nobody else did and rebuild mechanical watchmaking as a luxury category when every rational economic argument said the category was finished. The history is real. The problem is what the industry does with it. The Swiss-made label, as we have explored on this channel before, requires 60% of manufacturing costs to be generated in Switzerland, not 60% of components, not 60% of the parts by count or weight, 60% of manufacturing costs, which is an accounting figure engineered to allow significant proportions of actual physical production to happen elsewhere, while the label reads as a guarantee of Swiss origin. The German watchmaking tradition that Walter Lang revived in Glashütte in 1990 operates under a completely different set of rules, produces watches to a completely different standard of manufacturing disclosure, and charges prices that the collector community has consistently assessed as more honest than the Swiss equivalents they compete against. The Swiss establishment understood what was coming out of Saxony in 1994. What they did not fully anticipate was Nomos. The loophole at the center of the Swiss-made argument has a German equivalent, and the German watch community discovered it in the early 20th century in a way that established a much stricter standard than the Swiss ever adopted. In 1906, a company called Nomos Uhrgesellschaft, a predecessor of the modern Nomos Glashütte, attempted to sell Swiss-made watches under the Glashütte name, trading on Glashütte's established reputation for precision German engineering without the Glashütte manufacturing reality behind it. A. Lange and Söhne filed a lawsuit immediately. The litigation established what became known as the Glashütte rule. To call a watch made in Glashütte, a specified proportion of the movement must be genuinely manufactured in the town of Glashütte itself. The rule is more demanding than Swiss-made in its manufacturing requirements because it grew from a lawsuit filed by a manufacturer defending the integrity of a geographically specific production tradition. The Swiss-made standard grew from a lobbying process managed by the industry it regulates. The difference in origin explains the difference in outcome. Glashütte made means something more specific and more verifiable than Swiss made, and the watches produced in that valley in Saxony have reflected that standard since 1990. What Ferdinand Adolf Lang did in Glashütte in 1845 requires a paragraph of its own because the context matters enormously. In the mid-19th century, Saxony was one of the poorest regions of Central Europe. Glashütte was a mining town whose mines had failed. The population was destitute in a literal sense. Lange, trained in the watchmaking tradition of Glashütte's neighbor Dresden, came to the town with a government loan, rented space, and began training local workers in watchmaking techniques they had never encountered. He was not building a factory in an existing watch industry. He was creating an industry in a place that had none, using public money in service of an explicit economic development mandate. Within 50 years, Glashütte had become one of the most recognized centers of precision watchmaking in the world. The pocket watches A. Lange and Söhne produced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were carried by officers, scientists, and royalty across Europe. The Grande Complication Reference 42500, delivered in 1902, incorporated a perpetual calendar with moon phase, a rattrapante chronograph with a foudroyant seconds function, and a minute repeater with petite and grande sonnerie. It sold for 5,600 marks. When it was recovered in 2001 in poor condition, it required 5,000 hours of restoration work by a team of 5 specialists. That is what the town of 7,000 people in the Müglitz Valley had built by the time the Soviet military arrived in 1945 and took the machinery away. The Soviet expropriation of Glashütte's watchmaking industry in 1948 was systematic and total. Every private manufacturer in the valley was nationalized into a single state entity called VEB, Glashütter Uhrenbetriebe, known as GUB. The individual brand names disappeared. The accumulated craft knowledge of the individual houses was pooled into collective production that served the Soviet bloc market rather than the international collectors who had valued the region's output before the war. The Lange name was gone from dials by 1951. For 40 years, the craft continued in a form the original manufacturers would not have recognized, producing watches for planned economy distribution without the commercial incentives that had driven the pre-war quality standards. Then the wall fell, and Walter Lange did not wait. He was in his mid-60s when reunification happened. He had spent his adult life watching a family legacy he had no power to recover. On December 7, 1990, he registered the name. He spent 4 years building a manufacture in a town that had been behind the Iron Curtain for almost half a century. He hired watchmakers whose training had happened under a system that had erased his family's name from its products. And in October 1994, he showed the Swiss watch industry what 4 years in the ruins of a Soviet-era collective could produce when the people doing the work understood what the work was supposed to mean. The Lange 1 was one of the 4 watches presented in October 1994. Its most distinctive feature was the outsized date, a double-disc calendar mechanism displaying the date in a window large enough to read without a loop, positioned at the 12 o'clock position in a format that Lange had patented specifically for this watch. The date mechanism required a subsidiary gear train of 46 additional components beyond what a standard date display needs. The reason for that complexity was simple: legibility. The date on a standard watch is printed in a small aperture at 3 or 6 or 4:30. The date on the Lange 1 fills a significant portion of the dial and reads from across a room. The cost of the 46 additional parts is absorbed into the price of the watch rather than eliminated in the interest of a lower retail figure. The Lange 1 also features an off-center dial layout, with the hour and minute display in the upper left quadrant and the small seconds subsidiary dial in the lower right, an asymmetric composition that was designed not to look different for its own sake, but because the complications the watch contains required specific placement to function without interference. The movement inside is a Lange manufacture caliber, hand-finished in the E. Glashütte tradition, with a 3/4 plate in nickel silver, a material that Swiss movement makers had largely abandoned for brass because nickel silver is harder to machine. Lange uses it because it is more stable and allows finer finishing. The cost difference is absorbed. The decision is disclosed. In 1999, 5 years after the first 4 watches, Lange presented the Datograph, and the Swiss boardroom conversations became more urgent. The Datograph is a flyback chronograph. Flyback means the chronograph does not need to be stopped before being reset. A single press of the reset pusher simultaneously stops, resets, and restarts the timing function, a feature that was originally developed for aviation timing where stopping the chronograph to reset it could cost a pilot critical seconds. What made the Datograph remarkable was not the complication itself, but the movement behind it. The Caliber L951.1 was the first serially produced, manually wound, entirely in-house chronograph movement developed by a prestige manufacturer in decades. It was not built on a base movement supplied by ETA or any other external supplier. Every component was designed and produced at the Lange manufacturer in Glashütte. The movement was finished with Glashütte ribbing across the main bridges, gold chattons housing synthetic jewels, heat-treated blued steel screws, and a freehand engraved balance cock with a swan's neck regulator in black polish. Each balance cock is different from every other because it is engraved by a different hand, and no 2 engravers engrave identically. Multiple watch experts across the industry, including the most respected independent critics in the collector community, have called the Datagraph's Caliber the finest chronograph movement ever placed in a wristwatch. The movement sent the Swiss industry to its boardrooms because in 5 years, a manufacturer in a former Soviet industrial valley had produced the most technically acclaimed chronograph in the history of the category. Lange had not caught up with Geneva. Lange had passed it. Nomas Glashütte was founded in 1990. The same year as A. Lange and Söhne in the same town, with a completely different brief. Where Lang positioned itself at the prestige tier from the beginning, Nomos was designed to make manufacturer-level Glashütte watchmaking accessible to buyers who could not spend $20,000 on a dress watch. The four original models, the Tangente, the Orion, the Ludwig, and the Tetra, were round and square-cased watches with Bauhaus-derived design language, clean dials, no unnecessary decoration, and in-house assembled movements priced to compete with the accessible end of the Swiss mid-tier. For the first 2 decades of Nomos's existence, the movements in those watches used an escapement sourced from external suppliers, specifically from Niverox, a Swatch Group subsidiary that held what multiple industry observers have described as a near monopoly on the supply of hairsprings and escapement components to brands outside the major groups. Nomos disclosed this. They did not pretend to be producing every component in-house when they were not. They said, "We source the escapement, we manufacture everything else in Glashütte, and here is the price the resulting watch costs." That transparency was unusual in the watch industry and remains unusual today. In 2014, Nomos presented the Swing system, and the disclosure story changed. The Swing system is Nomos's proprietary in-house escapement, developed over years at a total investment the brand publicly disclosed at approximately 11 million euros. The escapement includes the balance staff, balance wheel, balance spring, pallet lever, escape wheel, and the precise interaction between them that determines how accurately the movement keeps time. Producing an in-house escapement is so technically demanding and so capital intensive that only a small number of brands in the world have achieved it, most of them in Switzerland, and most at price points significantly above what Nomos charges for its watches. The Swatch Group, through Niverox, has supplied escapement components to dozens of brands because the alternative, developing the technology in-house, required an 11 million euro investment that most mid-tier brands concluded was commercially irrational. Nomos concluded it was commercially necessary. They could not claim genuine independence from the Swiss supply chain, while their most critical, timekeeping component came from a Swatch Group subsidiary, so they spent 11 million euros and built the component themselves. They named the calibers that contain it with the prefix DUW, standing for Deutsche Uhrenwerke, German Watchworks, a deliberate signal that the movement was now genuinely German in every component. A Nomos Tangente today, retailing at approximately $1,400, contains an in-house movement with an in-house escapement produced in Glashütte, finished in the Glashütte tradition with a 3/4 plate and decorative striping, transparent caseback, and a design whose clarity has been praised by the graphic design community more than by the watch community, because it is resolved in a way that graphic designers recognize and horologista sometimes undervalue. Put a Nomos Tangente next to a $2,000 Swiss watch from a brand whose movement was sourced from Sellita and whose escapement was sourced from Niverox. The Tangente costs less and contains more of what the word manufacturer is supposed to mean. Glashütte Original was the third major name to emerge from the Valley in the 1990s, founded in 1994 following the privatization of the former GUB Collective, and now owned by the Swatch Group, a fact that creates an interesting tension between the brand's Glashütte-made credentials and its corporate parentage in Biel. Glashütte Original produces watches that the collector community has consistently assessed as technically superior to Swiss brands at equivalent price points. Their Panomatic Lunar, with its distinctive off-center dual-dial layout showing hours and minutes on one subdial and small seconds on another, alongside a moon phase display, is one of the most compositionally sophisticated movements in the $5,000 to $10,000 category. The Senator Perpetual Calendar uses an in-house developed perpetual calendar mechanism. The 70s panorama date integrates Glashütte's characteristic panorama date display, a variant of the outsized date that Lange made iconic, into a 1970s-inspired case architecture. The brand produces approximately 95% of its watches in-house by value at its Glashütte facility, a figure that Swiss brands at comparable price points rarely match and even more rarely disclose. The Swatch Group ownership means some supply chain integration with the Swiss manufacturing infrastructure, but the manufacturing reality on the ground in Glashütte is documented and verified. Watches from Glashütte Original at $5,000 to $15,000 represent manufacturing quality that independent assessments have positioned above Omega and Breitling at comparable price points. Sinn is a different chapter of the German watch story entirely, a Frankfurt-based brand that occupies the tool watch tier with a specific and unusual combination of genuine instrument watch engineering and prices that make Swiss alternatives at the same specification look commercially aggressive. SIN was founded in 1961 as a supplier of instruments to the German aviation industry and entered the consumer watch market with the same engineering brief that had driven the aviation instruments. The watch must work correctly in the conditions it will encounter, and every specification claimed must be achievable in practice. The SIN 104 STSA, a manual wind pilot's watch retailing at approximately $800, uses an ETA movement in a case rated for extreme conditions, anti-magnetic, shock-resistant, and finished to a standard that SIN's aviation heritage enforces rather than markets. The SIN 556, a steel sports watch at just over $1,000, uses the brand's Tegement technology, a proprietary surface hardening process applied to the steel case that increases the surface hardness to a level that prevents normal scratching, making the case functionally unscratchable under standard daily wear conditions. No Swiss brand at the same price point offers Tegement. No Swiss brand at the same price point has a client list that includes the German Federal Police and the European Space Agency. SIN does not have a boutique on Bond Street or Fifth Avenue. They have a factory in Frankfurt and a customer base of professionals who need the watch to work. Mühle Glashütte sits at the quieter end of the Glashütte Valley's production output and represents the German watchmaking tradition at its most family scale and most transparent. Founded in 1869 as a precision instrument maker serving the maritime industry, Mühle Glashütte entered the wristwatch market with the same instrument-making sensibility that has characterized the Valley's output across its history. Their watches retail between $1,000 and $5,000 and use movements that are partially sourced and finished in-house, a reality they disclose specifically and without ambiguity. The Nautical Evomatics collection, produced for maritime navigation professionals, meets German Navy equipment specifications. The finishing on their movements uses the Glashütte three-quarter plate and decorative ribbing traditions. They are not Lange. They do not charge Lange prices. They charge what their manufacturing costs, and they explain what those costs are. The argument that German watchmaking is destroying Swiss watches is not an argument about market share. German brands produce a fraction of the volume of the Swiss industry and will continue to do so. It is an argument about what the price premium in the luxury watch category is supposed to represent and whether the Swiss industry is delivering what its own narrative promises. The Swiss-made label claims to guarantee a standard. The 60% cost rule that defines it allows a standard that the Glashütte rule, the SIN engineering brief, and the Nomos €11 million escapement investment would not satisfy. A. Lange & Söhne, the brand that drove that investment standard most visibly, makes 5,000 watches per year. Every one of them is assembled, disassembled, and reassembled by hand to a quality verification standard that the Swiss major group's annual volumes cannot accommodate. The datograph movement that the industry called the finest chronograph caliber ever placed in a wristwatch was built in the ruins of a Soviet-era collective by a 70-year-old man who had watched his family's factory dismantled into trucks half a century earlier. The Swiss boardrooms were right to be afraid. The argument coming out of Saxony was not that German watches were better than Swiss watches in every case. The argument was simpler and more damaging than that. It was that the price the Swiss industry charges for the story of quality should be matched by the quality itself, and that in the valley behind the Czech border, in a town of 7,000 people, there were watchmakers demonstrating that the match was possible. They are still demonstrating it. They have been demonstrating it since October 1994. The Swiss industry is still trying to answer.